This year marks the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And to mark that anniversary, we're going to do something different today. We're actually going to talk about a battle that the British won. Now, if you've watched the channel before, you know that we generally focus on telling the stories of lesser-known conflicts from history. So why would we spend an entire episode talking about a well-known battle that the Americans lost? Well, because while the British did win the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was such a Pyrrhic victory that it basically ended up being a turning point in the war, and led directly to the Americans taking control of the narrative of the conflict and turning world opinion in their favor. In other words, the Americans may have lost the battle, but they won the war because of it. So what was the Battle of Bunker Hill? And why is it so important? To understand why the Battle of Bunker Hill matters, we first have to understand why it was fought. By the spring of 1776, the relationship between Great Britain and her American colonies had broken down completely. Fighting had been ongoing for nearly a year over a series of unresolved issues regarding colonial autonomy and British attempts to exert greater control over the colonies, culminating with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and the siege of Boston that followed. The British were attempting to clear out the New England countryside, pushing the colonial militia back towards Boston, which was defended by American forces under the newly formed Continental Army. As British troops cleared out the surrounding towns, they took up positions in the city of Boston and on a series of hills surrounding the town known as the Beacon Hill, Dorchester Heights, and the most prominent of them all, Bunker Hill. These hills were the perfect place for the British to set up defensive positions from which they could oversee and control the surrounding areas, including the harbor. This gave them the high ground around Boston and allowed them to keep the American forces bottled up within the town. However, the Americans saw an opportunity to drive the British out and take the high ground for themselves. Early on the morning of June 1775, a detachment of American soldiers secretly set out from Boston across the Charlestown Peninsula, intending to take the British fortifications on Bunker Hill before they knew what was happening. Led by General William Prescott, a local militia officer from Charlestown, the Americans made their way up the hill under the cover of darkness, and set about digging trenches and building breastworks to form a defensive position. When the British officers noticed what was happening at dawn the next day, they scrambled to get their troops ready to repel the attack. Before long, 2 regiments of British the 23rd and 29th, were marching toward the American position atop Breed's Hill, determined to drive the Americans back and reclaim the heights. The British were confident of an easy victory. The regular army had been through rigorous training, having drilled hundreds of times in situations just like this. On the other side were the untrained and unseasoned colonial militiamen. According to one British officer, had not so much as ever seen the inside of a fortification. Not only were the Americans outnumbered by nearly 2 to 1, but their position was untenable. They were sitting ducks on a hill with nowhere to go but down. But as it turned out, the Americans were able to hold off the British assault again and again, repelling 3 separate attacks before finally giving way to the 4th. During these attacks, the British suffered heavy casualties, losing nearly half of their men, either killed or wounded, and when their commander, Lieutenant General Hunt, attempted to rally his troops to make one final push against the American lines, he was shot in the thigh and forced to be carried off the field himself. In the end, the Americans were driven from their position, but not before inflicting nearly twice as many casualties on the British and killing or wounding some of the most experienced officers in the entire British Army. The British had won the battle, but it was a hollow victory. What's more, word of the battle spread quickly throughout the colonies and abroad. While the British were celebrating their tactical victory, colonists were already erecting monuments to the fallen Americans, calling them heroes. And one of them, The woman known as the Molly Pitcher became a legendary figure of the entire Revolutionary War. To this day, she is remembered for grabbing her husband's musket when he fell in battle and continuing to fight in his place. It didn't matter that that story was almost certainly apocryphal. To the Americans, it represented the kind of courage and determination that the British simply couldn't match. And here's where things really get interesting. You see, there was an eyewitness account of the battle written by a man named John Farmer, who published it just 2 weeks after the fighting. But Farmer's account wasn't published in America. It was published in London, and it told a very different story than the one that was being told in the colonies. Farmer claimed that the British had actually lost the battle, citing eyewitness accounts from British officers who claimed that they had been forced to retreat in the face of American fire. Even worse, he blamed the American commander, General Washington, for failing to press his advantage and finish off the British, allowing them to escape. He said that the Americans had thrown away a certain victory and might have taken the whole of Boston if they had only pressed home their attack. The British public was outraged. They demanded to know why their army, the most powerful fighting force in the world, was being defeated by untrained colonial militia. When the true outcome of the battle was revealed, they were shocked. For weeks, London newspapers ran nothing but stories of the battle, and a phrase, "Beware of American," was scrunched into every corner of polite conversation. You see, the British thought they were the greatest fighting force in the world, and suddenly people were whispering in the taverns and coffee houses that the ragtag colonial militias could beat them, and beat them soundly. They had to come up with an explanation for how such a thing could possibly be, and the answer, of course, was that they hadn't. The Battle of Bunker Hill never happened. Okay, not really. The British didn't deny that the battle happened, but they did claim that it was a tactical victory for the British and that the Americans had fled the field in disarray. There were even rumors that the Americans had retreated not because they had taken heavy casualties, but because they had run out of ammunition, forcing them to flee in panic. And those rumors spread like wildfire throughout the American colonies. And this is where the story takes another strange turn. Because the Americans didn't bother to correct the record. They didn't send out pamphlets or write letters to newspapers denying the British claims. They just sat back and let the British dig their own graves. You see, the Americans knew that winning the war would require more than just military victories. It would require a propaganda victory as well, and they knew exactly what to do to ensure that that victory was theirs. In the aftermath of the battle, the Americans began to erect monuments, not to the fallen British officers who died trying to subdue the colonial uprising, but to the bravery of the common soldiers, both British and Hessian, who refused to fire on their fellow countrymen. They erected monuments to the slain British officers and encouraged artists to paint and sculpt their portraits. They also allowed British prisoners of war to return home, refusing to exchange them for captured Americans, knowing that the British government would be all too eager to take them in and parade them around as trophies of war. The Americans wanted the world to know that they were unhinged zealots looking to overthrow the British Empire and kill everyone who disagreed with them. They wanted the world to see that they were willing to treat their enemies humanely and that the real monsters in this story were the British. The Americans knew that they were fighting a global war and that the support of the rest of the world would be essential to their ultimate victory, and they knew that they couldn't win that war without winning the peace as well. Within a year of the battle, the Americans had accomplished their propaganda victory. Europe was solidly behind the colonies, and the British were second-guessing their decision to wage war on their unruly subjects across the sea. By the time the war was over, the Americans had won the peace as decisively as they had won the battle. In the end, the British may have taken the hill, but it was the Americans who took the war. Thank you for watching.